The fluorescent lights above the checkout counter hummed their familiar tune at 11:47 p.m., casting that sickly yellow glow over everything they touched. I'd been hearing that same electric whisper for 3 years now, ever since I started working the graveyard shift at Morrison's 24-hour grocery store. 3 years of the same routine. Clock in at 11, watch the last few stragglers grab their midnight snacks, then spend the next 8 hours in a tomb-quiet store with nothing but the hum of refrigerators and the occasional drunk college kid looking for energy drinks. I liked the quiet, or at least I'd convinced myself I did. The late shift paid better than day work, and it kept me away from the crowds, the small talk, the forced smiles. Just me, the empty aisles, and whatever podcast I could stream through my earbuds while I restocked shelves or cleaned the floors. It was lonely, sure, but it was predictably lonely. Safe lonely. That was before he showed up. I first noticed him on a Tuesday night in early March. I was hunched over the register, half asleep and scrolling through my phone when I heard footsteps crossing the linoleum. Not the shuffling of someone looking for late-night munchies, but the deliberate steps of someone who belonged here. Someone with purpose. I looked up and saw a guy about my age, maybe 26, 27, standing near the customer service desk with a nervous energy that seemed to radiate from his shoulders. He had dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it one too many times, and he was wearing a crisp Morrison's polo that still had the store creases in it. New hire, obviously. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice had this quality to it that made me sit up straighter. Not deep, not particularly smooth, but there was something warm underneath the uncertainty. "I'm looking for Marcus. I'm supposed to start tonight." Marcus was our night manager, a guy who spent most of his shift in the back office playing solitaire and pretending to do inventory. I gestured toward the rear of the store. "Office is back there, past the deli counter. He's probably asleep at his desk." The new guy laughed, and the sound caught me off guard. It wasn't polite workplace laughter, it was genuine, like he couldn't help himself. "Great first impression I'm making then?" I found myself almost smiling. "Trust me, Marcus has seen worse. I'm David, by the way. Ethan." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I guess we'll be working together." There was something in the way he said it, not resigned or dreading it, but almost hopeful. Like maybe working the dead-end graveyard shift at a grocery store might actually be something to look forward to. "Yeah," I said and realized I'd been staring. "Welcome to the glamorous world of night shift retail." He grinned at that, and I noticed the way it transformed his whole face. The nervous energy didn't disappear, but it shifted into something brighter, something that made the fluorescent light seem less harsh. I should probably go find Marcus before he fires me for being late on my first day. "You're not late," I said quickly. "Shift doesn't start until midnight." Ethan checked his watch and his shoulders relaxed. Good. I was starting to panic. After he disappeared toward the back office, I sat there for a long time, just staring at the space where he'd been standing. The store felt different somehow. Less empty, even though he was gone. Like the air itself had changed. I shook my head and went back to my phone, but I couldn't concentrate on whatever article I'd been reading. Instead, I found myself listening for voices from the back office, wondering what Marcus was telling him about the job, about the routine, about me. 20 minutes later, they emerged together. Marcus looked like he always did. Rumpled uniform, coffee-stained tie, the general appearance of a man who'd given up on life somewhere around 1990. Ethan looked eager and slightly overwhelmed, carrying a stack of training materials and a name tag that he kept fidgeting with. "David," Marcus called out, his voice echoing in the empty store. "Show the kid how to work the floor. Start him on aisle 7. Cereal and breakfast stuff. Easy enough that he can't screw it up too badly." I bristled at the casual dismissiveness in Marcus's tone, the way he talked about Ethan like he wasn't standing right there. But Ethan just nodded politely and followed me toward the stockroom. "Don't take anything Marcus says personally," I said once we were out of earshot. "He's been here since the store opened, and I think his soul died somewhere around year 12. Ethan laughed again, and I realized I was already becoming addicted to that sound. Noted. So what's the real story about working here? The unvarnished truth. I considered this as I grabbed a hand truck and started loading boxes of Cheerios and Lucky Charms. It's boring as hell 90% of the time. The other 10%, you're dealing with drunk people, insomniacs buying weird combinations of things at 3 in the morning, or Marcus having a meltdown because corporate is asking him to actually manage something. Sounds terrible, Ethan said, but he was still smiling. It has its moments. I pushed the loaded cart toward aisle 7. The pay is decent. The hours mean you never have to deal with rush hour traffic, and if you like solitude, it's perfect. And if you don't like solitude, something in his tone made me glance over at him. He was looking at the boxes we were unloading, but there was a thoughtfulness to the question that suggested it wasn't just idle conversation. Then you learn to like it, I said, or you find another job. We worked in comfortable silence after that, falling into an easy rhythm. I'd hand him products to stock, he'd arrange them on the shelves, and occasionally one of us would make a comment about the absurd variety of breakfast cereals or wonder aloud who was buying the off-brand stuff at the back of the shelf. What struck me was how naturally we worked together. No awkward bumping into each other, no confusion about who should do what. It was like we'd been doing this for months instead of minutes. So, what brought you to the exciting world of overnight retail? I asked as we moved on to the oatmeal section. Ethan was quiet for a moment, arranging packets of instant oatmeal with more precision than the task really required. Needed a change, he said finally. My last job was, well, let's just say it wasn't working out. There was something in his voice that suggested there was more to the story, but I didn't push. Everyone who ended up working nights had their reasons, and most of them weren't particularly cheerful. What about you? He asked. What's your story? I handed him a box of steel-cut oats and tried to figure out how to answer that question. The real answer was complicated, a series of small failures and missed opportunities that had led me to accept that this was probably as good as things were going to get for me, but that seemed like too much honesty for someone I'd known for less than an hour. Fell into it after college, I said instead. Thought it would be temporary. How temporary are we talking? 3 years and counting. Ethan nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you're not paying attention. Exactly. We finished stocking aisle 7 around 1:30 a.m. The store was completely empty by then. Even the insomniacs tended to stay home on Tuesday nights. I showed Ethan where we kept the cleaning supplies and how to work the floor buffer, though we probably wouldn't need it until later in the week. Coffee? I asked as we finished up. There's a pot in the break room. It's terrible, but it's caffeine. Lead the way. The break room was a windowless space with fluorescent lights that somehow managed to be even more depressing than the ones in the store. There was a round table with mismatched chairs, a refrigerator that wheezed ominously, and a coffee maker that looked like it had been purchased sometime during the Clinton administration. I poured 2 cups of coffee that looked more like motor oil and handed one to Ethan. He took a sip and winced. Wow, you weren't kidding about it being terrible. Welcome to Morrison's, where the coffee is strong enough to wake the dead, and the dead would probably prefer to stay asleep. We sat at the table, both of us staring into our coffee cups like they might reveal some great truth about the universe. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged with something I couldn't name. Like we were both waiting for something to happen, neither of us sure what. So, Ethan said finally, what do you do when you're not here? During the day, I mean. It was such a normal question, the kind of thing people ask when they're trying to get to know each other. But for some reason, it made me feel exposed, like he was asking something much more personal than my hobbies. Sleep mostly, I said. It takes a while to adjust to the schedule. Your whole life gets flipped around. You're eating dinner at breakfast time, trying to sleep when everyone else is going to work. It's disorienting. Sounds lonely. There was something in the way he said it that made me look up for my coffee. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not pity, but understanding maybe, like he knew something about loneliness himself. It can be, I admitted, but you get used to it. Do you? The question hung in the air between us. I wanted to say yes, to maintain the fiction that I'd successfully adapted to this solitary existence. But something about the way he was looking at me made dishonesty feel impossible. I thought I had, I said quietly. Ethan nodded like that made perfect sense. I used to work days at my last job, 9 to 5, office full of people, constant meetings and phone calls and emails. I thought I hated it, all that noise and chaos and having to be on all the time. What changed your mind? Going home to an empty apartment every night? He took another sip of the terrible coffee and made that same face. Turns out being alone by choice feels different than being alone because you have to be. I felt something shift in my chest at his words, like he'd put his finger on something I'd been trying not to think about for 3 years. So, why take a night job then? I asked. This is about as alone as it gets. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table. Maybe I'm hoping it won't be. The words were so quiet I almost missed them. When I looked up, he was staring at his hands, and there was something vulnerable in his posture that made my throat tight. Before I could figure out how to respond to that, we heard the familiar chime of the front door's opening. I glanced at the clock on the break room wall, 2:15 a.m. Duty calls, I said, standing up. Could be anyone. Insomniacs, shift workers getting off late, people having emergencies and needing band-aids or whatever. We walked back out into the store together, and I felt hyper-aware of the space between us, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something clean and understated, but not so close that we were touching. Not that I was thinking about touching him. The customer turned out to be a woman in scrubs, who looked like she'd had the longest day in human history. She grabbed a frozen dinner, a bottle of wine, and a container of ice cream, the universal trifecta of someone who was done with everything. Rough night? I asked as I rang up her purchases. She gave me a look that could have withered houseplants. Honey, you have no idea. After she left, Ethan and I went back to work. The rest of the shift passed quietly, restocking the produce section, organizing the pharmacy shelves, running the floor buffer over the main aisles. Normal, routine tasks that I'd done hundreds of times before. But everything felt different with Ethan there. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was full of possibility. When we worked side by side, I found myself noticing things. The way he concentrated when he was arranging products, tongue pressed against his lower lip. The way he pushed his hair back when it fell into his eyes. The way he'd start to say something, then catch himself, like he was editing himself in real time. Around 4 a.m., we were working on the seasonal display near the front of the store, Easter candy and garden supplies, because apparently March was when people decided they needed both chocolate eggs and fertilizer. Ethan was trying to get a particularly stubborn shelf to lock into place while I sorted through boxes of Peeps and plastic eggs. Come on, he muttered at the shelf, putting more force behind it. Just, the shelf gave way suddenly, and Ethan stumbled backward, directly into a display of potting soil. The bags were stacked higher than they should have been, and the whole thing came down like dominoes. For a moment, we both just stood there staring at the chaos, 20-pound bags of dirt scattered across the floor, a few of them split open and spilling their contents. Ethan looked mortified. I'm so sorry, he started, but I was already laughing. I couldn't help it. The whole situation was so absurd, the two of us standing in a mini disaster zone of potting soil at 4 in the morning, Ethan looking like he'd committed some terrible crime against agriculture. It's not funny, he said, but he was starting to smile too. It's a little funny, I said, and then he was laughing along with me. It wasn't even that amusing, objectively speaking. But something about the late hour and the empty store and the sheer ridiculousness of it all made it feel like the funniest thing that had ever happened. We stood there laughing until we were both breathless, the sound echoing off the walls and making the space feel alive in a way it never had before. Marcus is going to kill me, Ethan said when he finally caught his breath. Marcus won't even notice unless someone tells him. And I'm not telling him. Really? Really, besides, I've seen worse. Last month, the dairy delivery guy knocked over an entire display of wine bottles. Now that was a disaster. We spent the next 20 minutes cleaning up the mess, working together to sweep up spilled dirt and restack the bags. It should have been annoying, more work, a problem to solve. But I found myself almost grateful for the chaos because it gave us something to focus on together, a shared task that felt more meaningful than stocking shelves. There, I said as we positioned the last bag. Good as new. Better, actually, Ethan said. The display looks more stable now. He was right. The bags were more evenly distributed, the whole structure more solid. Sometimes things had to fall apart before you could put them back together properly. The rest of the shift passed without incident. We finished the seasonal display, restocked the pharmacy section, and did a final sweep of the store to make sure everything was in order. By the time 7 a.m. rolled around, I was surprised at how quickly the time had gone. Usually, the last 2 hours of my shift dragged endlessly. I'd find myself checking the clock every 10 minutes, counting down until I could finally leave. But with Ethan there, I'd barely noticed the passage of time, and if anything, I felt like we'd just gotten started. Marcus emerged from his office at 6:55, looking exactly as disheveled as he had when he'd disappeared 8 hours earlier. He did a perfunctory walk around the store, nodded at our work, and mumbled something about seeing us tomorrow night. "So that's it?" Ethan asked out as we gathered our things from the break room lockers. "We just leave? Day shift takes over at 7. We're free until tomorrow night." "And what do you do with your freedom?" I considered the question. What did I do with my days? Sleep until noon, usually. Maybe catch up on laundry or grocery shopping, the irony of which wasn't lost on me. Sometimes I'd try to watch a movie or read a book, but my brain was usually too fried from the night shift to focus on anything complex. "Sleep," I said honestly. "Try to pretend my circadian rhythm isn't completely destroyed." "What about you?" "I'm not sure yet, and this is all new to me." We walked toward the front of the store together, past the checkout counters and the customer service desk where we'd first met. Through the large windows, I could see the sun starting to rise, painting the parking lot in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful in that way that sunrises always are, but there was something melancholy about it too. The end of another night, another shift, another 8 hours that felt both endless and too short. Ethan stopped at the front doors and turned to face me. "Thanks," he said, "for today, for showing me around, helping me get settled. It could have been, well, it could have been a lot worse. Could have been a lot better too," I said. "Once you get used to the routine, it's pretty mind-numbing." "Maybe, but I don't think it'll be boring." There was something in his voice when he said it, something that made me look at him more carefully. He was studying my face like he was trying to memorize it, and I felt heat rise in my cheek. "The night shifts used to drag on forever," I found myself saying. "But with you here, I almost wish they wouldn't end." The words were out before I could stop them, more honest than I'd intended to be. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "David," he started, then stopped himself. He looked uncertain again, like he had when he'd first walked in looking for Marcus. But underneath the uncertainty was something else. Hope, maybe, or possibility. He seemed to be working up the courage to say something, his mouth opening and closing like he was testing out different words. Finally, he took a small step closer to me. "See you tomorrow night?" he asked softly. The question was simple enough, but the way he asked it, like my answer mattered, like it would determine something important, made my heart skip. "Yeah," I said, "see you tomorrow night." He smiled then, that same transformative smile I'd noticed earlier, and pushed through the doors into the morning light. I watched him walk across the parking lot to a beat-up Honda Civic, watched him drive away, and only then realized I was still standing there like an idiot. As I walked to my own car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The routine I'd settled into, the comfortable loneliness I'd convinced myself I preferred, the predictable emptiness of the late shift, all of it felt different now. I drove home through streets filled with early morning commuters, people heading to their day jobs while I headed home to sleep. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about how disconnected I felt from the rest of the world. Instead, I was thinking about tomorrow night, about whether Ethan would still seem nervous or if he'd settle into the rhythm of the job, about whether we'd laugh like that again, easy and unguarded, about the way he'd looked at me when he asked if he'd see me tomorrow night, like the answer actually mattered. I'd spent 3 years convincing myself that solitude was preferable to the messiness of human connection, that the quiet predictability of the night shift was exactly what I wanted. But 8 hours with Ethan had shattered that illusion completely. The night shifts used to drag on forever. But with him there, I almost wished they wouldn't end, and tomorrow night couldn't come soon enough. Part 2. I didn't sleep well that day. I should have been exhausted. 8 hours on my feet, the adjustment period of working with someone new, the emotional weight of whatever had passed between Ethan and me in those final moments at the door. Instead, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every glance, every moment when the space between us had felt charged with possibility. "See you tomorrow night?" The question echoed in my mind, carrying a weight that felt disproportionate to the words themselves. It should have been casual workplace pleasantry, the kind of thing people say without thinking. But the way he'd asked it, soft, almost hesitant, like my answer would determine something important, made it feel like so much more. When I finally did sleep, I dreamed of fluorescent lights and empty aisles, of laughter echoing through a quiet store, of someone standing just out of reach in the shadows. I woke up at 6 p.m. feeling more tired than when I'd gone to bed, but also electric with anticipation. The hours until my shift started stretched ahead of me like an eternity. I showered, made dinner that I barely tasted, and found myself checking the clock every few minutes like a teenager waiting for a date. Which was ridiculous because this wasn't a date. This was just work. Just another night shift at Morrison's grocery store, the same job I'd been doing for 3 years. Except it didn't feel the same anymore. I arrived at work 15 minutes early, something I hadn't done in months. The parking lot was mostly empty. Just Marcus's ancient Buick, and now Ethan's Honda Civic, which made my pulse quicken inexplicably. He was already here. I found him in the break room, sitting at the same table where we'd shared terrible coffee the night before. He was reading what looked like a training manual, but he glanced up when I walked in, and his face lit up with that smile that I was already becoming addicted to. "Hey," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice, like he'd been looking forward to seeing me as much as I'd been looking forward to seeing him. "Hey yourself, you're here early." "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, closing the training manual. "Thought I'd come in and review some of this stuff. Make sure I don't embarrass myself on day 2. Trust me, after yesterday's potting soil incident, the bar is pretty low." He laughed at that, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Whatever awkwardness I'd been worried about, whatever tension might have lingered from our conversation at the door, it wasn't there. Or if it was, it had transformed into something warmer, more comfortable. "Fair point, though I'm hoping today will be less catastrophic." "Where's the fun in that?" We fell into conversation easily about sleep schedules and adjusting to night work, about the weirdest customers he'd dealt with at his previous jobs, about the best coffee shops that were open late for people like us who lived on vampire hours. It was the kind of casual workplace chat that should have been unremarkable, but I found myself hanging on every word, cataloging the small details of his voice and expressions. When Marcus finally emerged from his office at 11:30, looking as rumpled and disinterested as ever, we were both ready to start the shift. Tonight's task list was longer: inventory count in the pharmacy section, reorganizing the seasonal displays, and a deep clean of the produce area that was long overdue. "Think you can handle the pharmacy?" I asked Ethan as we reviewed the list. "It's mostly just counting pills and organizing shelves, but it requires attention to detail." "I can handle attention to detail," he said, and there was something almost flirtatious in his tone that made me glance at him sharply. But he was already walking toward the pharmacy section, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it. We worked separately for the first few hours, but I found myself making excuses to walk past the pharmacy section. Just checking on progress, I told myself, making sure he didn't have any questions. Definitely not looking for opportunities to see him bent over inventory sheets, tongue pressed against his lower lip in concentration. Around 1 a.m., I was restocking the cereal aisle when I heard footsteps behind me. "Need any help?" Ethan asked. "I finished the pharmacy count." "Already? That usually takes me half the night." He shrugged. "Like I said, I'm good with details. Plus, I may have been motivated to finish quickly." "Motivated by what?" "Better company out here." The words were casual, but there was something underneath them that made my hands still on the box of frosted flakes I'd been holding. When I turned to look at him, he was closer than I'd expected, and close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Is that so?" I managed to say. "That's so." We stood there for a moment, looking at each other in the harsh fluorescent light of aisle 7, surrounded by breakfast cereals and the low hum of refrigerated cases. It should have been mundane, unremarkable. Instead, it felt like the most important moment of my life. "Well," I said finally, clearing my throat. "Grab a box. Might as well make yourself useful." The next few hours passed in a blur of easy collaboration. We worked side by side on the seasonal display, rearranging Easter decorations and garden supplies with the kind of natural teamwork that usually took months to develop. Our conversations flowed effortlessly, jumping from childhood memories of Easter egg hunts to debates about whether anyone actually bought those plastic lawn flamingos, to shared observations about the strange things people purchased at 3 a.m. "I had a guy come through last night around this time," I told him as we organized bags of mulch. "Bought $50 worth of birthday candles and nothing else." $50? That's like, what, 500 candles? Maybe he was planning a really impressive birthday cake? Or maybe he was starting a candle store and decided Morrison's was his supplier of choice. Or maybe, Ethan said, grinning, he was planning to recreate that scene from 16 Candles, but bigger. God, I haven't thought about that movie in years. It's a classic, though probably problematic by today's standards. Most classics are, when you really think about it. We were arranging the display so that we were working toward each other from opposite ends, and somewhere around 2:30 a.m., we met in the middle. I was reaching for a bag of potting soil at the exact moment Ethan was straightening a row of plant food, and our shoulders brushed. It was barely contact, just the fabric of our uniforms, touching for a split second. But neither of us moved away. Instead, we both went very still, hyper aware of the space between us, of the warmth radiating from that small point of contact. Sorry, Ethan said quietly, but he didn't step back. It's fine, I replied, equally quiet, and I didn't step back either. We stood there, shoulders barely touching, both of us pretending to focus on the display, but really just existing in that moment of connection. I could smell his cologne again, that clean, understated scent that was becoming familiar. I could hear his breathing slightly unsteady. The moment stretched between us, fragile and electric, until the sound of footsteps from the back of the store made us both jump apart like we'd been caught doing something we shouldn't. It was just Marcus, emerging from his office for one of his periodic tours of the store, but we'd stepped away from each other so quickly that I felt breathless. Like we'd been interrupted in the middle of something intimate instead of just standing near each other in front of a garden display. "How's it going out here?" Marcus called, his voice echoing in the empty store. "Good," I called back, hoping my voice sounded normal. "Almost finished with the seasonal setup." Marcus nodded and continued his circuit, disappearing down the canned goods aisle. When his footsteps faded, Ethan and I looked at each other. That was... He started, then stopped. "Yeah," I agreed, even though he hadn't finished the thought. We went back to work, but something had shifted. The easy comfort was still there, but underneath it was something more charged, more aware. When we passed each other in the aisles, I felt the space between us like a physical thing. When our hands brushed, reaching for the same product, the contact seemed to linger longer than necessary. Around 4 a.m., we found ourselves in the produce section, hosing down the vegetable displays and wiping down the refrigerated cases. It was mindless work that we could do while talking, and somehow the conversation had turned more personal than it had the night before. "So, what did you do before this?" I asked as I sprayed down a rack of lettuce. "You mentioned your last job wasn't working out, but you never said what it was." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, focusing on cleaning the apple display with more attention than the task really required. "Marketing," he said finally. "Corporate marketing for a tech company downtown." "That sounds actually pretty good. Good pay, normal hours, career advancement opportunities. Yeah, it was all of those things." He moved on to the oranges, still not looking at me. "Great job, great colleagues, great benefits. Everything I thought I wanted." What changed? He was quiet again, and I started to think he wasn't going to answer. Then he set down the cleaning cloth and leaned against the produce case, finally meeting my eyes. "I was miserable," he said simply. "Every single day I'd wake up and feel this weight in my chest like I was suffocating. I'd sit in meetings talking about quarterly projections and brand synergy, and all I could think about was how none of it mattered, how I was spending 40 hours a week on things that meant absolutely nothing to me." I stopped spraying the lettuce, giving him my full attention. There was something raw in his voice, something vulnerable that made me want to reach out and touch his hand. "So you quit?" "So I had what I guess you'd call a breakdown." He laughed, but there was no humor in it, right in the middle of a presentation about our new social media strategy. Just stood up, walked out of the conference room, and kept walking until I was outside. Didn't go back. Jesus. My boss called that afternoon wanting to know if I was sick. I told him I was quitting, effective immediately. He asked if I was having some kind of mental health crisis, which was probably the most perceptive thing anyone at that company had ever said. I didn't know what to say to that. The corporate world had always seemed foreign to me, all those suits and meetings and complicated hierarchies. But the idea of being trapped in something that made you that unhappy, that felt so fundamentally wrong that you'd rather walk away than spend another day there. I understood that. "That's why you ended up here?" "That's why I ended up here. Figured I'd rather be poor and working a job that doesn't pretend to be meaningful than make decent money doing something that was slowly killing my soul." He was looking at me intently now, like he was trying to gauge my reaction. Like he was worried I'd think less of him for admitting to what probably looked like a spectacular failure from the outside. Makes sense to me, I said. Really? Really, I mean, most people probably think we're both crazy for choosing to work the graveyard shift at a grocery store, but if it feels right, I shrugged. Sometimes feeling right matters more than looking right. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. Exactly. That's exactly it. Besides, I added, grinning, the night shift has its perks, such as better pay, no crowds, no corporate bullshit, and the company. I paused, suddenly aware of what I was about to say. The company's not bad either. Ethan's smile was soft and genuine. No, no, it's not bad at all. We finished cleaning the produce section in comfortable silence, but I could feel something building between us. Not tension exactly, but awareness. Like we were both hyper-conscious of every movement, every glance, every moment, when we moved close to each other in the narrow aisles between the displays. By 5 a.m., we'd finished everything on Marcus's task list and then some. The store looked better than it had in weeks. Organized, clean, fully stocked. We'd worked together with the kind of efficiency that comes from truly understanding each other's rhythm, anticipating what the other person needed before they asked for it. Think Marcus will be impressed? Ethan asked as we surveyed our work. Marcus will probably take credit for it, I said. But yeah, he'll be impressed. The next 2 hours passed quietly. A few customers trickled in, the usual mix of shift workers and insomniacs, but for the most part, we had the store to ourselves. We spent the time doing small maintenance tasks, organizing the stockroom, making sure everything was perfect for the day shift. But mostly, we just existed in each other's company. Sometimes talking, sometimes working in comfortable silence, but always aware of each other. I found myself noticing small things about him. The way he hummed quietly while he worked. How he double-checked everything to make sure it was exactly right. The way he'd catch me looking at him and smile, like he didn't mind being watched. Around 6:30, Marcus emerged from his office and did his usual perfunctory inspection. He nodded approvingly at the state of the store, mumbled something about good work, and retreated back to his office to wait for the day shift. So that's another night down, I said as we gathered our things from the lockers. Yeah. Ethan was moving slowly, like he was reluctant for the shift to end. Feels like it went by fast. It did. We walked toward the front of the store together, past the checkout counters and the customer service desk. Through the windows, I could see that it was another beautiful morning. Clear skies, golden light painting everything in warm tones. But instead of feeling melancholy about the end of the night like I usually did, I felt content, like something had been accomplished that went beyond stocking shelves and cleaning floors. We stopped at the front doors, and I felt that familiar hesitation, the same moment of not wanting to leave that I'd experienced the night before, but stronger now. Like we'd crossed some invisible line during the shift and going our separate ways felt wrong. Thanks for tonight, Ethan said. For letting me help with everything, for listening to my dramatic life story. I know it's probably more than you signed up for when you agreed to train the new guy. It wasn't dramatic, I said. And even if it was, I don't mind. It's nice to have someone to talk to during these shifts. Someone who gets it. Gets what? That sometimes the unconventional choice is the right choice, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. I don't know why, but I like these shifts now. I was dreading this job when I took it. Figured it would be 8 hours of boredom and loneliness every night. But it's not. Not with you here. The words hung in the air between us, more honest than either of us had been prepared for. I felt my heart speed up, felt that familiar heat rise in my cheeks. Ethan, I should go, he said quickly, like he'd realized he'd said too much. Let you get some sleep. But he didn't move toward the door. Instead, we stood there looking at each other, both of us seeming to wait for something neither of us could name. See you tomorrow night? He asked, just like he had the night before. Yeah, I said. See you tomorrow night. This time, when he smiled, there was something different about it. Less uncertain, more sure. Like whatever questions he'd been asking himself, he'd found at least some of the answers. He pushed through the doors and I followed him outside, both of us walking slowly across the parking lot toward our cars. The morning air was cool and crisp, full of the promise of spring. Birds were singing in the trees that lined the parking lot, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sounds of the city waking up. This is me, Ethan said, stopping next to his Honda. This is me, I replied, gesturing to my own car 2 spaces over. We stood there for another long moment, keys in our hands, but neither of us making any move to unlock our doors. The parking lot was empty except for us and Marcus's Buick, the morning light making everything look soft and golden. Drive safe, I said finally. You too. I got in my car and started the engine, but I didn't immediately pull out of the parking space. Instead, I sat there for a moment, watching as Ethan got into his own car. He started his engine, then just sat there too, both of us apparently reluctant to be the first one to leave. Finally, I put the car in reverse and backed out of my space. As I drove toward the parking lot exit, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw that Ethan was still sitting in his car, watching me leave. Even as I turned onto the main road, I could see him in the mirror, a small figure in a beat-up Honda, still and waiting, like he was hoping I might turn around and come back, like he was waiting for something neither of us could say yet. I drove home through the quiet morning streets, but my mind was back in that parking lot, back in the store with Ethan, back in all those moments when the space between us had felt charged with possibility. Whatever was happening between us, this connection, this awareness, this careful dance around something when we were both afraid to name, it was getting stronger. And tomorrow night couldn't come soon enough.